Rightio. It's been a minute and a half. My script on the Indian partition has been distracted by the fact I've been stuck in an endless deep spiral of research on the AC-1 Sentinel, the greatest tank never made. Well, the AC-4, the cruiser variant, but you'll see that in a video most likely soon. Yeah, I know I said I'd never do tank videos, but I also said I never would become a YouTuber, and tanks look cool, so you lot will be getting tanks. But in the meanwhile, to tide things over, I have a story from the vault of the world's worst navy to tell you. And it's the tale of the Royal Sovereign, the ship that got what it did not deserve. But first, a word from Rex's hangar and myself.
Someone should make a YouTube channel called that.
My god, what an idea!
Yeah, that's right, we started a channel together, and it's all going to be Age of Sail stuff, so for the people who keep asking when I get asked for video suggestions about Age of Sail stuff, that's where it's going. And yeah, there's going to be videos on the Russian Navy during the Age of Sail on that channel. Mark my words, they'll be on there. This story, today though, has two separate beginnings. Well, really three actually. Maybe four if you really consider it, but they're all a matter of perspectives. But where do we start? Do we start with the birth of the Royal Navy? Battleship, the Royal Sovereign, the building of the Vittorio Veneto class, or do we go east and talk about the insanity at Tsushima that left the Russians playing catch-up on battleships and then the revolution? Well, the answer's kind of all three. On the 15th of January 1914, the hull of a large ship was laid down in Portsmouth Dockyard. This was the very height of the naval arms race between the Royal Navy and the Imperial German Navy, and in many ways this large new ship was the culmination of the race from the British perspective. After being ordered in 1913, the new hull was set to be 580 feet long, 88 feet wide, and displace up to 31,200 tons at a full load. Now, of course, this is a really far cry from the massive battleships of the Second World War, but by 1913 standards, she was second only in battleship design to the behemoth fast battleships of the Queen Elizabeth class of super dreadnoughts. And you could argue the Bayern class from Germany, however they did not enter service until right at the end of the war. This new ship would travel at a top speed of 21.5 knots, a bit slower than her big sisters from the Lizzies, but more than adequate by the day's standards for battleships. Keep in mind that the American standard battleships of the day potted along at around 20 knots standard, so 21.5 is nothing bad at all. This new ship, part of the R or Revenge class battleships, would upon completion be notable for their sleek lines and tall single funnel. Unlike many others of the day which usually sported two, in my opinion, these are some of the most gorgeous looking battleships ever built upon their completion. There were some issues though. The ships were rushed into service by Jackie Fisher, and so naturally they incurred a few little Fisherisms. For example, her spotting tops were too close to her funnel, making them useless in weather that didn't include wind. The hull would thunder down the slipway though 4 days after the Gallipoli landing in 1915 on the 29th of April, and joined the fleet on the 18th of April the next year as His Majesty's ship Royal Sovereign, armed with 4 twin 15-inch guns, 14 single 6-inch guns, and a smattering of small other weapons, including, interestingly, some of the first anti-aircraft guns fitted as standard on new battleships. She was armoured at the belt with 13 inches of protection, 1 to 4 across the deck, 6 to 10 at the barbette, and up to 13 inches on the turrets. The Revenge class was supposed to be 8 ships: Renown, Revenge, Resolution, Royal Oak, Royal Sovereign, Ramillies, Resistance, and Repulse. However, some changes were made. Resistance was cancelled in 1914 to free up some budget space, and Renown and Repulse were designed into a pair of extremely powerful battlecruisers, leaving 5 ships of the Revenge class in service during the First World War. Admiral Jellicoe intentionally gave the order to the ship to stay behind in Scapa Flow during the Battle of Jutland just after she joined service, deeming her to be too new and too green to be of any assistance, and to be honest, she would have probably been a bit of a liability given how green her crew was. The Grand Fleet, now joined by Royal Sovereign, would sortie on the 18th of August 1916 to ambush the High Seas Fleet, while it advanced into the southern North Sea. There would, though, be a series of miscommunications and mistakes during the action of the 19th of August that prevented Jellicoe from intercepting the German fleet before it returned to port. 2 light cruisers were sunk by German U-boats during this operation, which prompted Jellicoe to decide not to risk the major fleet units. Keep in mind that during this period, the Royal Navy had effectively one job: stay alive. And so, with this in mind, the Admiralty concurred, and stipulated that the Grand Fleet would not sortie unless the German fleet was attempting an invasion of Britain, or there was a strong possibility it could be forced into an engagement under suitable conditions with minimal risk to the British ships. In April 1918, the High Seas Fleet again sortied, though, in a much smaller strength, to attack British convoys to Norway. They enforced strict wireless silence during the operation, which prevented the cryptanalysts from warning Admiral Beatty, the newly appointed commander of the Grand Fleet. The British learned of the operation only after an accident aboard the battlecruiser HMS Moltke, which forced the ship to break radio silence when she sought assistance to report her issues. Even though the odds of interception weren't very high, Beatty ordered the Grand Fleet to sea to intercept the Germans, but this was unsuccessful. This was the last time Royal Sovereign and the rest of the Grand Fleet would go to sea for the remainder of the war, with the German fleet surrendering on the 21st of November. Meanwhile, over in Russia, now, you all know this story. When the 2nd Pacific and the 3rd Pacific Squadrons sailed northwards to Japan, they met the fleet of Admiral Togo, which proceeded to tear apart the Russian Navy in half so badly that it didn't recover in terms of size and strength until well into the 1970s, and even then it was a facade of the immense battle fleets of the Tsardom. Tsar Nicholas II and his governments attempted to rebuild the fleet, however the reality was the empire was in a state economically. Russia simply could not focus on the navy. There were more important things like mass riots and mutinies and, well, communism. The launching of the Dreadnought made this even worse, given the fact that Russia now needed to build even larger ships to keep pace with other powers. Now, Russia would actually manage to get 8 Dreadnoughts in the water of the Gangut and Imperator Maria class, along with the singular Imperator Nikolai I, that absolutely cracked one from World of Warships. However, the Russian Empire exploded during the First World War, and without going too far into it in this video, the ships in the Russian Navy were split between different forces. Some ended up in French Africa, some with the Reds, some on the bottom, and many more rusting in internment. Hell, some of the destroyers wound up in, of all places, Peru. That's a story for next time, the Russian destroyers in Peruvian service, because it's quite interesting. The Soviets, though, were left with 4 ships of the older Gangut-class dreadnoughts, and needless to say, the Soviet fleet was in an absolute state at the end of the revolution. It was a major goal of Stalin to reconstitute the surface fleet, though, which had only 3 very old battleships in various states of rebuild, and the Poltava, I believe it was, in a complete wreck sitting in harbour, but she would be made semi-useful during the Second World War. These ships were interesting to say the least, but very, very dated, sporting only 12-inch guns compared to the 15-inch guns being used on the Royal Navy, or 14 to 16-inch guns being used on the Japanese and American Navy's battleships. Stalin wanted this rectified and quickly, so the Soviets began to look into some options, including designs such as the enormous Sovietsky Soyuz, a mega ship that most likely would have never been completed even if the Germans hadn't rolled through, and so the grand new Soviet fleet, consisting of some questionable heavy cruisers that we've spoken about before, and an ambitious light cruiser building program, was left extremely wanting, with no major battleships or carriers and no real chance at getting them. That is until 1943, when Mussolini fell, and Italy threw in the towel. Back to the Royal Sovereign though, and I'm aware this is a Russian Navy video and we're focusing on her British service, but I want to highlight just how much of a storied career this ship has before, the happening. The end of the First World War saw a downsizing of the Royal Navy, with 500 men leaving the ship in 1919. As the conflict between Greece and Turkey, along with the Russian Civil War, heated up though, the Royal Sovereign and her sister Resolution, upon with their escorts, were sent into the Med via Malta, taking on Western Europeans fleeing Constantinople, and White Russians fleeing the Red Army, including some members of the Russian aristocracy. The excitement over, Royal Sovereign found herself on the chopping block at the 1922 Washington Naval Treaty, the treaty designed to stop another war, cut the battle fleet strength from 40 to 15 battleship hulls. It was decided that the Queen Elizabeths and the R-classes, due to their 15-inch uniform armament, would be retained, split between the Atlantic and Mediterranean fleets. Then 1927 rolled around and the ship was placed into reserve and given a major refit with new searchlights and rangefinders before being assigned to the 1st Battle Squadron in the Med with Revenge and Queen Elizabeth. As the 30s rolled around, the R-Class began to really show their ages, and it was during this period that 3 of the 5 Queen Elizabeth-class battleships underwent major refits, with Queen Elizabeth, Warspite and Valiant emerging looking completely different. It was the intention of the Royal Navy to actually retire the 5 older R-Class ships as the new King George V class entered service, but the year was 1939, and war was on the horizon. The naval treaties were out the window, and Royal Sovereign sailed north to Scotland with HMS Rodney, Royal Oak, Repulse and Nelson under the command of Charles Forbes to form the new home fleet. On the 31st of August 1939, the day before Germany invaded Poland, Royal Sovereign was assigned to a screening force patrolling the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap for German merchant ships attempting to run home. When war finally came in September, she joined the 2nd Battle Squadron of the Home Fleet and was later assigned to the North Atlantic Escort Force, based in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Her job was to protect convoys on their way to Britain from heavy German raiders such as the Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, Admiral Scheer and Admiral Hipper. It's interesting that there is a certain logic that even if one of these older battleships could not fight to win, she could cause significant damage even if she sinks to make the German raider unable to return home. This very nearly occurred in an interesting engagement when one of the R's, almost in a twist of fate, ran into the Bismarck, but thankfully Bismarck turned the other direction, and the old R-Class, she stayed alive. The Scharnhorst and Gneisenau would actually be given express orders to not engage convoys if they did see a battleship with it, even if it was one of these old R-Classes, because those 15-inch guns, oh boy, they hit like a freight train. After a brief refit in Plymouth though, Royal Sovereign returned to the Mediterranean in 1940, where her lack of speed would actually prevent her from impacting major fleet actions such as Calabria, leaving Warspite to fight alone. In mid-August 1940, while she was in the Red Sea, Royal Sovereign was unsuccessfully attacked by the Italian submarine Galileo Ferraris. She returned to the Atlantic convoy duties later that month, continuing until 1941 in August before she sailed to the United States for a refit. In May 1941, the Admiralty actually planned to establish a strong fleet in Singapore, the so-called Rock of the East, to deter Japanese expansion in Southeast Asia. Royal Sovereign and her sisters, Revenge, Ramillies and Resolution, Royal Oak had sadly been sunk by Good Prix and U-47 at this point, were assigned to this force, with the fleet scheduled to assemble by March 1942. By the end of March 1942, the Eastern Fleet had been formed under Admiral Somerville, consisting of 2 fleet carriers, the older carrier Hermes, 5 battleships, including Royal Sovereign, her sisters plus Warspite, 7 cruisers and 16 destroyers. Although many of the sizable ships, including the 4 Revenge-class battleships, were extremely outdated, it must be said. The Japanese Kitabutai under Vice Admiral Nagumo, with 6 carriers and 4 fast battleships, significantly outmatched Somerville's fleet in terms of speed and striking power from a distance with their fleet air arm. As a result, only Warspite would actually be able to operate with the carriers, while Royal Sovereign and her sisters and Hermes were relegated to convoy escort duties. That is until late March. See, codebreakers at the Far East Combined Bureau warned of a Japanese raid targeting Colombo and Trincomalee. Somerville split his forces, with Force A being with the fleet carriers, Warspite and cruisers, and Force B with Royal Sovereign and her sisters and Hermes. His hope was to intercept the Japanese in a night battle. Somerville searched for several days without success before refueling at Adu Atoll. During this sweep, most people aren't aware that the 2 fleets only just missed each other, and it was only by chance that the Royal Navy battle fleet avoided running smack bang into the Japanese fleet at night. While we don't know what would have happened, we do know that the Royal Navy would have had the edge in gunnery had they encountered the Japanese Navy that night, and they had by far the firepower to sink every single ship in that fleet, as Warspite so aptly demonstrated at the Battle of Matapan against the Italians. However, with the power of the Long Lance torpedo, nobody really knows what would have happened, but we do know that Warspite has plot armour, so in all likelihood, every ship in the British fleet would have sunk to Long Lances, and the Warspite, through the power of, well, just plot armour, would have stood up out of the water and beaten the Japanese fleet to death, so that's probably what would have happened, let's be honest. Following the April raid, Royal Sovereign and her sisters were withdrawn to Mombasa to secure the shipping routes in the Middle East and the Persian Gulf. They departed Adu Atoll on the 9th of April and remained stationed in Mombasa until September 43, except for a major refit again in the United States, this time in Philadelphia. In late 1942, she actually shared the yard with USS Boise, recovering from her damage at Guadalcanal. Fun fact, the USS Boise had Steve Irwin's father-in-law on it when she was at the Battle of Guadalcanal. He served during that fight. There's your trivia fact for the day. Royal Sovereign returned to the Indian Ocean in late 1943 to resume patrol duties before departing for Britain in January 1944. And then, this ship with its storied history that we've just gone over, its fantastic career, was about to be given over to the power of hell. When Italy surrendered in 1943, Stalin, with an insane amount of audacity, demanded part of the Italian Navy as payment for their assistance in the defeat of the Axis power. Quite literally how they assisted in defeating the Italian Navy, I can't tell you, save for a fact there was, from memory, a handful of small craft in the Black Sea operated by Italians. Not a single Soviet sailor helped in the Med. The British, for their part, saw the Soviet demand for the new Vittorio-class battleships, laughed, and then said something along the lines of "bugger off." So Stalin went and asked the Americans, who themselves had done relatively little to fight the Italian Navy, their navy instead being focused on the Atlantic and the Pacific, not the Med. But nevertheless, in the interest of cooperation, Roosevelt decided to appease Stalin and agree that the USSR should be compensated. Naturally, this was without even having to bother to consult the Royal Navy, but given that it was January 1944 and major operations were underway, Churchill acquiesced. But not entirely. The British agreed the Soviets should be compensated. But they could have the newly refitted Giulio Cesare, a ship even older than the Royal Sovereign, dating back to 1911, and that was in such a state that the ship needed a couple years worth of work done before she could make her way to the Soviet Union into a Soviet port. Stalin was really angry at this kind of cheeky runaround and demanded a new battleship. Like Cartman stomping and demanding something in a South Park episode, Stalin went so far as to demand a British King George V class complete with all of its new toolings and radars. Some say he pointed to the brand new HMS Howe, which was just being completed. The Royal Navy agreed that they really did deserve a ship, and so they went to the Soviets to smooth things over, and they offered them a brand new battleship, just out of the refit yard, called the Royal Sovereign. It kind of helped that the Royal Navy really didn't need an old R-class anymore. Stalin, licking his wounds and being very impressed at the regal-sounding name, because clearly it was an important ship, agreed, and plans were set in motion. The British then sailed her to Murmansk to collect the Soviet crew for the battleship, and Captain Peachy, an Irishman— that second part, the Irish part, will become very clear why I mentioned it soon, because Celtic shenanigans are afoot— set off in the battleship to pick up all the men. Peachy is a hell of a character. He's the kind of man who will sarcastically insult you while vomiting from seasickness on the bridge of his warship. There is a reason he was chosen for this next part, and there's a reason his officers were chosen for this next part. The Royal Sovereign was only one of the ships being transferred, alongside the older USS Milwaukee, an Omaha-class cruiser, 6 destroyers, and 4 submarines. One of the submarines would actually be sunk on the way back to Russia because she was pottering around on the surface and got spotted by the Coast Guard. It was decided that the Soviet crews would be treated as guests during this transfer window. In reality, though, this was a great chance for Western powers to study their temporary Eastern allies, the winds of the Cold War already absolutely stirring by this point. It would also allow Royal Navy officers and other people of note, aka spies, to make some key contacts with the Soviet military. But the problems began pretty early on. One notable issue was that Soviet ratings, as in normal enlisted sailors, had extreme issues using plumbing. No, Russia is not beating the allegations. In the space of 24 hours after she got back to Rosyth in Scotland, just as an example, the dockside toilets at the Royal Navy base in the UK were so blocked they were unusable. The Soviet officers on the voyage meanwhile proceeded to mistake the wardroom bathroom for a sauna, filling it with steam, not actually using it as a shower. The commissar aboard, a man called Gordiev, one day walked up to the officer of the watch, effectively the man in command of the ship while the captain was below, and demanded that the officer stop what he was doing, aka navigating the ship through a war zone, to pour him a bath. The Royal Navy officer, knowing that he had to, be nice, and also under the command of Captain Peachy, decided it was time for some Celtic shenanigans. And he knew exactly what to do. He told the commissar to, wait a moment, just give me a moment, I've just got to do this one thing and I'll come run your bath, so absolutely, I'll be your good little Jenkins. And so he waited just long enough to ensure the fresh water was turned off. And then he told the commissar how to turn the tap on. The commissar proceeded to then get a faceful of raging hot steam. Not satisfied with this, the British officers then took little extra steps to be cheeky, pointing out to the Soviet crews just how much nicer the officers' smokes were in comparison, sewing holes in what they began to call comradely equality. Meanwhile, down in the Royal Sovereign's engine room, a British stoker who was a declared proud communist on day one of the voyage and was really excited to see some comrades aboard from the heart of the revolution, spent 2 weeks dealing with Soviet sailors and commissars around him, and then broke down shouting how much he hated everything red. British sailors were at first very concerned to notice that the Soviets had sent armed sentries around the ship to watch their own men, but after a while the British realised that the Soviets weren't going to annoy them because, well, they had orders to only punish their own sailors. So allegedly, they began to just walk up to them and pull funny faces like they were in a Monty Python movie to see if they could get a reaction. Mind you, the Soviets were also being a little bit cheeky because when the non-commissioned officers in the Soviet Navy realised how much food was on board, they began to sneak back into the mess lines for second helpings. The Soviet Admiral Levchenko would then go to Captain Peachy, absolutely incensed that the Royal Navy, after the ship made port, was stealing all the stores aboard the Royal Sovereign, because they were unloading chests, ignoring the fact that these were personal chests belonging to midshipmen, and were quite broken and were being replaced with new ones for the Soviet officers. The Soviets then demanded spare 15-inch gun barrels because the British ones were used, never mind that they were not even 25% of the way through their service life based on 200 full charged rounds being fired. A British officer, and I can't confirm this one, as in where he's from, but I've seen two sources that say he was a Scotsman, turned, laughed in their faces, and said, "It was unlikely that you will hit anything if you shoot at it anyway, so you don't need new barrels." When I said Celtic shenanigans were afoot, they are afoot. A Russian officer then tried to brag to the British crew that it only took 20 minutes for a Russian warship to reach action stations and fire on an enemy when it was spotted, ignoring the fact it took the Royal Navy about 20 seconds because of how its action stations orders worked. The Soviets then allegedly responded in the conversation that the 20-second comment was Western propaganda. After a little while, this absolute sideshow that belongs in a Monty Python film, and there's so many more things that happened that I couldn't 100% confirm, ended with the raising of the Soviet naval ensign on the 30th of May 1944, commissioning the ship into the Soviet Navy as the Archangel or Arkhangelsk, bringing her 26th career in the Royal Navy to an end and beginning her torture. The Arkhangelsk would remain alongside in Rosyth for some time before finally setting sail on the 12th of June, according to a sailor on HMS Howe, which had been moored far away to avoid the Soviets spying on her radars. The Arkhangelsk made her way to Scapa Flow, and then on the 16th of August she made her way east to the USSR as part of the convoy escort for JW-59. Wildly, the British plan worked, and many of the Soviet sailors actually formed decent relations with the British officers, despite all the shenanigans, including Admiral Levchenko. During her voyage back to the USSR, the convoy came under attack from U-711, whose captain, Hans-Gunther Langer, reported that incorrectly he had struck the battleship with at least one, maybe two torpedoes. The torpedoes in question, though, had actually exploded prematurely, giving only the impression to the submarine's crew of an impact. The Germans really bought into this, though, and when the Arkhangelsk was moored in Kola, they launched repeated attacks on the ships. All these failed, though, and they did intend to send midget submarines after it, but thankfully for the Arkhangelsk, she had already left port by the time of the attack. The ship would then set sail again to patrol the White Sea, and that's where she would pretty much spend most of her wartime service under the Soviet flag. But this loner battleship, meant to be returned at the war's end, well, she's not getting back to the UK for another 4 years. The Arkhangelsk made 2 short voyages in June 1945 with a double complement, for some reason, but the Soviets never really got a handle on how to actually sail a vessel of this size, and in 1947 she was run aground. Keeping it all very hush-hush, the Soviets refloated the ship and sent her back to port. The reason this was all hush-hush is because now the Iron Curtain was really down across Eastern Europe and the Cold War was in full swing. The Soviets by now were seemingly content to keep the Royal Sovereign forever, but on the 15th of December 1948, the Julio Cesare was finally handed over to the Reds and renamed to Novorossiysk, prompting the Royal Navy to demand the return of the Archangelisk, which in hindsight may have been a mistake. The Archangelisk would return to the United Kingdom, and on the 4th of February 1949, a small Royal Navy party went aboard to help guide her into Rosyth. The state of the ship upon her return to the United Kingdom is straight up out of an eldritch horror story. Fair warning, if you are eating, I'm going to recommend you put the food down, or maybe switch off until you've digested it. The guns, starting simply, were completely rusted in place, never once being fired, and the Soviets never actually turned the guns in the entire time they had it in service, or if they did, they hadn't done it in years. They were rusted in place. The toilets were interesting. I'll leave it at that. There was mold growing on surfaces that should have been regularly cleaned, including inside showers and officers' chambers, which were allegedly being used as saunas and then not cleaned, and so there was mold everywhere. And then there was the food. The Soviets had been throwing food everywhere. When they were done with something, they'd throw it into the hold, onto the floor, into the gun turrets. Every nook and cranny basically just had food thrown into it. And this led to rats. So many rats that a Scottish dockyard worker's first-hand account of her scrapping describes them as, when the ship was cut open, writhing like a mass carpet, moving on a pile of rot. Oh, that's disgusting to think of. The ship was a floating biohazard. And in all honesty, it would have probably been better if she'd have been towed out to sea and had a nuclear bomb put aboard her. The worst part of this is the Royal Sovereign was not alone. Those other loaner ships, including the Milwaukee, were allegedly in the same kind of condition. The sad reality is, though, that the Royal Sovereign is one of the most illustrious names in Royal Navy history, belonging first to the renamed Sovereign of the Seas, one of the most gorgeous ships ever built in 1660, and then to multiple first-rate ships of the line, including the flagship of Admiral Collingwood at the Battle of Trafalgar. Sadly, since the horror of the Battleship Archangelisk, the name has not been reused. But yeah, it's quite disgusting, and I could get much more descriptive on the state of that ship, but you don't need to vomit. You can imagine it. Just for those wondering, the state of the Archangelisk and the state of the Moskva are not that separate from each other at the time of their sinking and return. Let that sink in. With your appetites ruined, I will leave you there. Thank you all for watching. Like, comment, subscribe to the Lesser of Two Weevils, link in the pinned comment. We really do intend to just have fun going over tales from history from the Age of Sail. I've already put up a video on the Battle of Pulo Ora. Rex will be putting out something very, very shortly. That's going to be fantastic. And in future, I have some great videos on the wreck of the Dunbar, a clipper ship that went down. And in future, I'm intending on covering everything from convict transportation and how it evolved from transportation to Australia towards the Gulag system in the Soviet Union. And like I said, there's a whole world of the Age of Sail in the Russian Navy that I have not even scratched on, and I intend to touch on it a bit over at the Lesser of Two Weevils. So like, comment, subscribe to both channels, and I will catch you all next time. F in the chat for the Archangelisk, aka Royal Sovereign. Just F in the comments, just dozens and dozens of Fs, because she did not deserve what happened to her.